Hi and welcome back to Reddit Whispers. So last night was a journey, one of those ones that you can't really explain to people who aren't in the deep, weird trenches of a long-term relationship, especially one that's recently been upgraded to include a tiny, screaming human who runs on a schedule that seems scientifically engineered to break you. It all started around 3 a.m., which, as any new parent knows, isn't really the middle of the night so much as it is just another shift change at the factory of sleep deprivation. Our little boy, Leo, started crying. It wasn't the full-blown, red-faced siren he reserves for when he's truly outraged by the injustice of a wet diaper or an empty stomach. It was more of a whimpering, a slow ramp-up, the kind of sound that slips into your dreams and twists them into something anxious before you even surface. I was deep under, dreaming of something mundane, probably about spreadsheets or fixing a leaky faucet, the kind of boring dad dreams you have when your REM cycle is constantly being carpet-bombed. I started to roll over, a purely instinctual move, the first step in the well-worn ballet of the night feed. My arm was reaching for my wife, Chloe, to do the whole your turn or my turn negotiation that usually happens with a series of grunts and nudges, but I stopped. My eyes were barely open. The room was a soupy gray, but I could see her. She wasn't asleep and she wasn't getting up. She was sitting up, bolt upright, and just staring at me. And it wasn't a normal stare. It wasn't the loving gaze you see in movies or even the tired, vacant stare of a fellow exhausted parent. No, this was something else entirely. This was a stare of profound and absolute betrayal. It was the kind of look that could curdle milk from across the room. It was the kind of stare that makes you immediately, and without any evidence, question every single thing you have ever done in your entire life. My half-asleep brain tried to catch up. Did I forget to take the trash out? Did I leave a wet towel on the bed? Did I say something stupid in my sleep? The possibilities were endless and terrifying. Leo's cries were getting a little more insistent in the background, a soundtrack to my sudden, chilling interrogation. The air in the room felt thick, heavy with unspoken accusations. I could feel my heart start to beat a little faster, that cold jolt of adrenaline that comes when you know you're in trouble but you have absolutely no idea why. Her eyes, which are usually this warm, gentle brown, looked like dark, hard stones in the dim light from the baby monitor. There was no movement, no sound from her, just this intense, focused beam of pure fury aimed directly at my face. I've seen her angry before, of course. We've had our arguments, our disagreements, the standard stuff that comes with sharing a life, a home, and a bathroom. But this was different. This was a silent, simmering rage that felt ancient and deeply personal. It was as if she wasn't just mad at me, but at the very concept of me. My mind was racing, trying to piece together the events of the previous day. We had a good day, I thought. We took Leo to the park, we ordered pizza, we watched a movie, or at least the first 20 minutes of one before we both passed out from exhaustion. There were no fights, no simmering tensions, nothing that could possibly warrant this 3 a.m. tribunal. I finally managed to croak out a "what's up?" which felt like the most inadequate question ever asked in the history of human language. The sound of my own voice seemed to break the spell, but not in a good way. It was like I had just confirmed my own guilt by speaking. She didn't blink, her expression didn't change. Her voice, when it came, was flat, cold, and utterly convinced of its own truth. She said, "You abandoned us." And that was it. No explanation, no context, just that one devastating sentence hanging in the air between us while our son wailed from the next room. My brain simply could not process it. Abandoned you? When? How? I was right here. I had been right here all night, literally glued to the mattress next to her. The most adventurous journey I had been on was a brief trip to the bathroom at midnight. I could still feel the faint imprint of the pillow creases on my cheek. I was and had been demonstrably present. The accusation was so bizarre, so completely untethered from reality, that for a second I thought I was still dreaming. Maybe I had woken up into one of her dreams, a nightmare where I was the villain. But the baby's cries were very real, a sharp, insistent reminder that this was, in fact, happening. This was my life now. I was a dream criminal, on trial for a crime I didn't commit in a reality that didn't exist, and the ridiculousness of it all was what really threw me. Just a few months ago, before Leo was born, we had this long, serious talk about the future, about protecting our family. We were getting all our ducks in a row: wills, life insurance, the boring but necessary stuff. And during that conversation, we created this thing, this inside joke with a serious core, that we called our prenup with Neptune. It was our promise to each other, a symbolic pact that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with commitment. We promised that no matter how big the storm, how high the waves got, we would always be each other's anchor. We would navigate the chaos together. It was our way of saying that our partnership was bigger than any external force, that we would always choose each other. We called it the Neptune clause because it was about weathering the unpredictable seas of life, and it felt so much more profound and romantic than any legal document. We shook hands on it. We wrote it down on a silly napkin that's still tucked away in a drawer somewhere. It was our ultimate insurance policy against the world. And now here I was being accused of the very thing we swore we'd never do, the ultimate violation of the Neptune clause. And the basis for this accusation, her dream, a figment of her subconscious, a random firing of synapses in her sleep-deprived brain. It was maddening. It was insane. I was slowly starting to realize marriage. While I was trying to formulate a defense, to explain that I had been unconscious and drooling on my pillow for the past 5 hours and was therefore incapable of abandoning anyone, Leo's cries escalated. He had moved from whimpering to full-on, lung-busting screaming. The sound was a physical presence in the room, a screaming indictment of our parental failure in this moment. And I was stuck. I couldn't go to him because I was currently in the dock, a defendant in the case of the people versus dream-abandoning husband. Moving towards the baby would be seen as fleeing the scene of the crime. Staying put meant letting my son scream. It was a perfect, impossible trap. Chloe, for her part, still hadn't moved. She was the stoic, unyielding judge, jury, and executioner, seemingly oblivious to the real, tangible needs of our child just a few feet away. Her focus was entirely on me, on the spectral crime I had committed in her slumber. I could see the narrative playing out in her head. She had a dream, a vivid, emotionally charged dream where I had left her and Leo, and in the fuzzy, liminal space between sleep and wakefulness, that dream had bled into reality. The feelings were real for her, the fear, the anger, the sense of betrayal. And because I was the cause of those feelings in her dream, I was now the target of them in the real world. It didn't matter that it wasn't logical. Emotions aren't logical, especially not at 3 a.m. when you're running on fumes and your hormones are all over the place. I understood that on an intellectual level, but it was hard to remember when I was being pinned to the bed by a look of such pure contempt. This tiny, dark room had transformed into a courtroom, and my pillow, probably still damp with my drool, was the only piece of evidence for my defense. It was Exhibit A for the case of he was literally comatose, but it felt like flimsy evidence in the face of her absolute certainty. The whole situation was so absurd, it was almost funny. Almost. But it's hard to find the humor when you're being emotionally prosecuted by the person you love most in the world, while your infant son sounds like he's trying to summon a demon in the nursery. This wasn't in any of the parenting books. They tell you about diapers and feeding schedules and sleep training, but they don't tell you how to defend yourself against dream-based allegations of desertion. There's no chapter on what to do when your wife's subconscious decides to put you on trial in the middle of the night. Marriage is wild sometimes. It's this crazy, beautiful, terrifying thing where you share everything with another person, your hopes, your fears, your finances, your bed, and apparently your dream crimes. And you have to navigate it all, even when it makes no sense, even when you're so tired you can barely remember your own name. All I wanted to do was sleep. All our baby wanted was to be fed or held or changed. All my wife wanted, it seemed, was to convict me of a felony that had taken place entirely in her mind. And I, The alleged criminal just wanted to understand the charges. But there was no understanding to be had, not really. There was just the staring, the crying, and the heavy, suffocating silence in between. The night was far from over. I was on trial, and I had a feeling the sentencing was going to be harsh. The silence stretched on, punctuated only by Leo's increasingly frantic wails from his crib. My mind, now horribly awake, was scrambling for a defense, a way to bridge the insane chasm that had opened between my reality and hers. This wasn't just about a bad dream. I knew that. A dream is just a dream, a weird movie your brain makes when you're asleep. But the feelings it leaves behind, those can be powerful. They can linger like a ghost in the morning. And for Chloe, who was navigating the emotional and hormonal minefield of new motherhood on about 3 hours of broken sleep a night, a dream about abandonment wasn't just a random story. It was her deepest fears being given a starring role. I knew her history. I knew about her father leaving when she was a kid, the instability of her childhood, the deep-seated fear of being left to fend for herself that she had worked so hard to overcome. We had talked about it for years. It was part of the reason we created our prenup with Neptune. It was our symbolic stand against that fear, our declaration that our family would be different, that our foundation was solid rock, not shifting sand. I was her rock. That was my job, my promise, my most sacred duty. And now her own mind had cast me as the very person she feared most. I had become her father in a dream, and that phantom version of me was now sitting in my place in our bed. It was a betrayal of the highest order, and the fact that it wasn't real didn't make her feeling of betrayal any less potent. The logic was clear to me, but logic had no place in this courtroom. This was a trial of emotion, and on that front I was losing badly. I tried to think back to see if I had done anything at all to plant this seed in her subconscious. Had I been distant? Had I been working too much? Had I complained about being tired? Every normal, mundane action of the past few weeks was now being re-examined in my mind as potential evidence for the prosecution. That time I stayed late at work to finish a project. Selfishness. The night I fell asleep on the couch while on baby duty. Negligence. That joke I made about needing a vacation. A clear statement of my intent to flee. My own brain was turning against me, building a case for her side. This is what sleep deprivation does. It erodes your sanity, your sense of proportion. It turns a dream into a declaration of war. I looked at her, still sitting there, a statue of righteous anger, and I tried to project an aura of unwavering calm and reliability. I tried to be the guy who doesn't abandon his family in dreams. But it's hard to look reliable when you're sleep-rumpled, confused, and probably have a weird pillow line etched on your face. Leo's crying was like a drill, boring into my skull. It was a constant, pressing emergency that was being completely ignored because of a non-existent one. A part of me, the tired, frustrated part, was getting angry. This was insane. I hadn't done anything wrong. I was being accused, tried, and convicted without a shred of real evidence. I was being held accountable for the actions of a fictional character that my wife's brain had created. I wanted to yell, to shout that this was crazy, to tell her to snap out of it and pay attention to our screaming child. But I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that this was the absolute worst thing I could possibly do. Any anger from me, any defensiveness, would just be seen as confirmation of Dream Me's guilt. It would prove her subconscious right. See, he is angry, he is defensive. He is the kind of man who would abandon us, so I had to sit there and take it. I had to be the calm, understanding partner, even as my own sanity felt like it was fraying at the edges. This was the fine print of the Neptune clause, I supposed. It wasn't just about weathering external storms like job loss or illness. It was about weathering the internal ones, too. It was about holding the anchor steady when your partner's boat is being tossed around by a hurricane of their own making. So I took a deep breath, letting it out slowly. I tried to soften my expression, to look less like a confused defendant and more like a loving husband. I thought about our years together, the journey that had brought us to this dark, messy, beautiful moment. I remembered our first date, how we talked for hours until the restaurant closed, how I knew almost immediately that she was the one. I remembered our wedding, standing on a cliff overlooking the ocean, making promises that felt as vast and as deep as the water below. I remembered the moment we found out she was pregnant, the mix of terror and elation that made us cling to each other, a two-person team against the world. This was the woman I loved, the mother of my child. She wasn't my enemy. She was my partner who was currently lost in a fog of fear and exhaustion. My job wasn't to win the case. It was to guide her back to shore. The baby's cries hitched, a sign that he was working himself up into a state of real distress. That was my opening. I couldn't address the dream directly, not yet. I had to deal with the most pressing reality first. I slowly, deliberately swung my legs out of the bed, making sure my movements were calm and non-threatening, as if I were approaching a frightened animal. "I'm going to get Leo," I said, my voice low and steady. I didn't ask for permission. It was a statement of fact, a declaration of my role as a father, a present and accounted for father. I half expected her to object, to say something like, "That's what you want us to think," but she remained silent. Her eyes followed me as I stood up and walked out of the room. The air in the hallway felt cooler, clearer. Leaving the bedroom felt like leaving the courtroom. I walked into the nursery, the smell of baby powder and diapers a welcome dose of reality. Leo was standing in his crib, holding onto the bars, his face red and wet with tears. He saw me and his cries immediately changed, the anger giving way to a desperate plea to be picked up. I lifted him into my arms, his little body warm and trembling against my chest. He buried his face in my neck, his sobs slowly quieting down to sniffles. This was real. This was tangible. This was not a dream. Holding my son, feeling his weight in my arms, I felt my own anchor touch the seabed. This was my truth. I was here. I was present. I was not going anywhere. I checked his diaper, which was fine. I offered him a bottle, which he took greedily. As he drank, his eyes started to droop, the storm of his distress passing as quickly as it had arrived. I walked with him, swaying gently back and forth in the quiet nursery, the only light coming from the glowing animal shapes on his sound machine. In this small, peaceful room, the drama in the bedroom felt a million miles away. Here things were simple. There was hunger and there was comfort. There was fear and there was safety. There were no dream crimes, no phantom betrayals. There was just a father and a son in the middle of the night. I wondered what was happening back in the other room. Was Chloe still sitting there, staring at the empty space where I had been? Was the anger starting to fade, replaced by the crushing weight of exhaustion? Or was she busy building an even more elaborate case against me in my absence? I knew that when Leo was back asleep and I returned to that room, the trial would resume. This little intermission was just a temporary reprieve. But something had shifted in me. Holding my son, I felt a new sense of clarity. The absurdity of the situation hadn't gone away, but my frustration had been replaced by a kind of weary resolve. This was my family. This crazy, exhausted woman in the next room and this tiny, helpless baby in my arms. And they were worth fighting for, even if the fight was against a dream. I would go back in there not as a defendant, but as a husband and a father. I would present my evidence, my presence, my actions, my love. I would appeal to the woman I knew was still in there, underneath the fear and the fatigue. I would honor the Neptune clause, even if she had forgotten it for a little while. I would hold the line because that's what you do. You hold the line, you ride out the storm, and you wait for the morning. Because the morning always comes. And hopefully, in the light of day, dreams fade and reality returns. I hoped. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only 20 minutes, Leo was fast asleep again, his little body limp and heavy in my arms. I gently placed him back in his crib, tucking his blanket around him, my movements slow and practiced. I stood there for a moment just watching him breathe, the soft, rhythmic rise and fall of his chest a reassurance that at least one person in this house was at peace. The walk back to my bedroom felt like walking the Green Mile. The quiet of the house was unnerving now, the air thick with anticipation. I didn't know what I would find when I opened the door. Would she be asleep? Would she be crying? Would she be waiting with a fresh set of accusations? I pushed the door open a crack and peeked in. The scene was almost unchanged. She was no longer sitting bolt upright, but she had only slumped down slightly, her back against the headboard. Her eyes were still open, and they found mine the second I entered the room. The intense, focused anger had dissipated slightly, but what replaced it was almost worse. It was a look of profound, weary sadness. The judge had left the bench, and now she was just the victim. The dream was still with her, I could see it. She was looking at me, but she was also looking through me at the ghost of the man who had hurt her in her sleep. I closed the door softly behind me and walked over to my side of the bed. I didn't get in. I just stood there a few feet away, creating a small, neutral space between us. The trial wasn't over, but perhaps we had moved to a new phase. Maybe this was the part where character witnesses were called. I decided to call myself to the stand. I started talking, my voice quiet, barely a whisper. I didn't defend myself against the dream. I knew that would be pointless. You can't argue with a feeling. You can't present a logical rebuttal to a nightmare. So I didn't try. Instead, I just started reminding her of our reality. I talked about the day we met, how I was so nervous I spilled coffee all over my shirt, and she laughed so hard she snorted, and in that moment I knew I was going to love her forever. I reminded her of the time we moved into our first apartment, a tiny, terrible place with a leaky ceiling and paper-thin walls, but we were so happy we didn't care. We spent a whole weekend painting the walls a ridiculous shade of yellow and dreaming about our future. I talked about our trip to the coast, the one where it rained for 3 days straight and we were stuck in a tiny cabin, and how that trip, which should have been a disaster, ended up being one of our best memories because we just talked and laughed and learned every single thing about each other. I brought up our prenup with Neptune. I reminded her of the conversation, sitting at our kitchen table, the seriousness and the silliness of it. I talked about what it meant to me, that promise. It wasn't just words on a napkin. It was the bedrock of everything we were building. It was my solemn vow that she and Leo would always be my priority, my true north. I told her I knew that my presence was my most important promise. Showing up day after day, not just physically but emotionally. Being there for the good stuff, but more importantly, being there for the hard stuff, for the 3 a.m. feedings, for the moments of doubt and fear. I told her I knew I wasn't perfect. I get distracted, I get tired, I leave my socks on the floor. But I told her that my commitment to her, to our family, was the most real and unwavering thing in my life. I was not the man from her dream. That man didn't exist. I was the man standing in front of her, the man who had been by her side all night, the man who had just rocked their son back to sleep. I was the man who loved her more than anything in the world, even when she was mad at me for something I didn't do. I talked for a long time. I just kept pulling up memories, pieces of our shared history, and laying them down in the space between us, building a bridge back to her. I was trying to anchor her back to our reality, to our story, the one we had written together day by day for years. As I spoke, I saw a flicker of something in her eyes. The hard, sad mask began to crack just a little. A tear spilled out of the corner of her eye and traced a slow path down her cheek. Then another. She didn't make a sound, but her body started to shake with silent sobs. That was my cue. The defense rests. I slowly moved to the bed and sat on the edge, still keeping a small distance. I didn't touch her, not yet. I just sat there, a quiet, steady presence, letting her feel whatever she needed to feel. The anger had been a shield, a way to protect herself from the raw fear that the dream had unearthed. Now that the anger was gone, the fear was all that was left. The fear of being alone, of being abandoned, of having to do this incredibly hard thing, this parenting thing, all by herself. It was an irrational fear, but it was her fear, and it was real to her in that moment. After a few minutes of silent crying, she finally spoke, her voice thick and broken. "He looked just like you," she whispered. And that was it. That was the heart of it all. In her dream, the man who had betrayed her had worn my face. Her subconscious had taken her greatest love and her greatest fear and merged them into one horrifying image. It was a cruel trick for a tired mind to play. "I'm here," I said softly. "I'm not him." She looked at me then, really looked at me for the first time since I woke up. She saw me, her husband, the guy with the pillow lines on his face, the father of her child. The ghost from her dream began to fade, exorcised by the steady light of reality. She reached out a hand and I took it. Her fingers were cold. I held them in mine, warming them up. The physical connection seemed to ground both of us. The courtroom was finally, officially dismissed. There was no verdict, no judgment. The case was simply thrown out, dismissed for its utter lack of connection to the real world. We sat there in silence for a while longer, holding hands in the dark, the only sound the soft hum of the sound machine from the nursery. The storm had passed. The waves were calming. The anchor had held. I was exhausted, more tired than I had been when I first woke up. It was an emotional exhaustion that went bone deep. We had been to a dark and strange place, my wife and we had found our way back. It was a reminder of how fragile things can be, how quickly a shared reality can be fractured by the weird, powerful forces of the mind. And it was also a reminder of how strong we were. Our prenup with Neptune had been tested by a phantom hurricane, and it had held. We hadn't broken. We had navigated the chaos. I finally crawled into bed, my body aching with fatigue. She shifted, turning to face me, and curled up against my side, her head on my chest. I could feel her tears soaking into my shirt. "I'm sorry," she mumbled into my chest. "I was just so scared." "I know," I said, stroking her hair. "It's okay, I'm here, we're okay." And we were. We were exhausted, we were emotionally battered, but we were okay. We were a team. Marriage really is a wild thing. It's not just the big, dramatic moments. It's the small, strange, middle-of-the-night moments, too. It's about defending yourself against dream crimes and learning to speak the language of fear and exhaustion. It's about knowing when to fight, when to be quiet, and when to just hold on tight until the sun comes up. As I finally drifted off to sleep, with the weight of my wife against me and the sound of my son breathing softly over the baby monitor, I had one last, coherent thought. I need to make sure I don't drool on the pillow tonight. I'm not sure my defense could withstand a second trial. The alarm went off at 6:30 a.m., a cruel and unusual punishment after a night like that. Waking up felt less like rising from sleep and more like being exhumed. Every part of my body ached with a fatigue that was more than just physical. It was the psychic weight of having gone through a whole legal drama while the rest of the world was sleeping. I rolled over and shut off the alarm, my movements slow and stiff. For a moment I lay there, listening. I could hear the baby stirring on the monitor, making his little grunting, stretching sounds that meant he'd be demanding breakfast soon. Beside me, Chloe was still asleep, her face relaxed and peaceful in the early morning light. Looking at her now, you would never guess that just a few hours ago she had been a stone-faced judge ready to send me to a dream prison for life. She just looked like my wife, tired and beautiful. The events of the night felt, appropriately enough, like a strange dream. Did that really happen? Did I really spend an hour defending my character against the actions of my own subconscious doppelganger? The damp spot on my t-shirt from her tears confirmed it was all too real. I slipped out of bed as quietly as I could, my joints creaking in protest, and went to start the coffee, the first and most essential step in the new parent's survival guide. As the machine gurgled to life, filling the kitchen with that blessed aroma, I leaned against the counter and stared out the window. The sun was coming up, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange. A new day, a fresh start. The night's madness felt a world away in the calm, rational light of morning. When Chloe finally came into the kitchen, a freshly changed Leo balanced on her hip, she looked hesitant. Her eyes were a little puffy, and she wouldn't quite meet my gaze. The awkwardness was a tangible thing between us, the quiet morning after of a fight, even if it was the weirdest fight in human history. I poured her a mug of coffee and handed it to her, our fingers brushing. "Morning," I said, my voice still rough with sleep. "Morning," she replied softly. She took a sip of the coffee, cradling the warm mug in her hands like it was a lifeline. Leo babbled happily, completely unaware of the psychological thriller his parents had co-starred in overnight. We moved around the kitchen in a quiet, familiar dance, getting the baby settled in his high chair, preparing his breakfast of mashed bananas, a ritual that was usually filled with sleepy chatter but was now overlaid with a layer of uncertainty. I wasn't angry. I was too tired to be angry, But I was something. Wary, maybe. It was a strange feeling to be wary of the person you're closest to in the world, not because you don't trust them, but because you've had a stark reminder that you don't always have access to what's going on in their head. You can share a bed, a house, a child, a life, but you can't share a mind. And sometimes their mind can decide you're a villain for no reason at all. Finally, as I was spooning banana into Leo's eagerly waiting mouth, she spoke. "About last night," she started, her voice barely above a whisper. "I am so sorry. When I woke up this morning, it feels so stupid now. I can't believe I did that." The relief I felt was immense. I hadn't realized how much I needed to hear her say that. "It was a pretty wild dream, huh?" I said, trying to keep my tone light. She gave a weak, watery laugh. "You have no idea. It felt so real. The feeling of being alone with him and you were just gone. It was terrifying." And there it was again, that core fear. The dream wasn't the problem. The dream was just the symptom. The problem was the fear, magnified by hormones and exhaustion into a monster in the dark. We talked then, really talked. As Leo happily smeared banana all over his face, his tray, and his hair, we dissected the night. She described the dream in more detail, a surreal, nightmarish landscape where I had simply walked away without a word. I talked about how it felt to wake up to that stare, the confusion, the feeling of being on trial. We talked about how the exhaustion was getting to both of us, how it short-circuits your rational brain and leaves all your raw emotions exposed. We acknowledged that new parenthood is beautiful and miraculous, but it is also a form of psychological hazing. It's designed to break you down and then rebuild you as something different, something stronger, but the process is brutal. And we talked about our prenup with Neptune. We reaffirmed it, right there in the banana-splattered kitchen. We promised to try and remember that we are on the same team, especially when our tired brains try to convince us we're not. We promised to be more gentle with each other, to give each other the benefit of the doubt, to remember that the real enemy is not each other, but the bone-crushing fatigue that comes with keeping a tiny human alive. It was a good conversation, a necessary one. It was the closing argument to the trial, a final clearing of the air. By the time we were cleaning up the breakfast carnage, the awkwardness was gone, replaced by the familiar comfort of our partnership. The whole bizarre episode was already being filed away into our shared history, destined to become one of those "remember that crazy time when" stories that you tell your friends, a testament to the sheer weirdness of married life. As I was getting ready for work, I caught my reflection in the mirror. I looked tired. There were dark circles under my eyes. But I also looked like a man who was loved, a man who was part of a team that sometimes had to battle phantom villains in the middle of the night, but a team nonetheless. I gave Chloe a kiss goodbye, a real kiss that said we're okay. I kissed the top of Leo's banana-scented head. As I walked out the door, I felt a sense of peace. Last night was a storm, a weird, internal, psychological hurricane. It was confusing and scary, and it tested our foundations. But we held on. We found our way back to each other. The Neptune claws held up. It turns out that sometimes the biggest waves aren't the ones the world throws at you. They're the ones that come from within, from the deep, dark, and unpredictable ocean of the human mind, from a place where dreams feel real and your greatest love can wear the face of your greatest fear. And navigating those waves together is what marriage is all about. It's wild and it's exhausting, but as I walked to my car in the bright morning sun, I knew with absolute certainty that I wouldn't trade it for anything. It's the wildest, best journey I've ever been on. Thank you for listening this story. Please leave your thoughts in the comments. Click like and subscribe to the Reddit Whispers for more.